Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. They told us it was just another flu season. That's what they always say, right? I remember the exact moment it stopped being just a rumor and became real. Like the moment you hear a car crash just outside your window. You're not sure it's happening at first until you see the smoke and hear the sirens. My name is Tyler Grant. I was a late-night radio host in Cincinnati, Ohio. WLXP 90.7, the voice of the valley, running a 2-hour show from midnight to 2 a.m. 5 nights a week. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. We covered local music, midnight poetry, sometimes true crime. It was quiet, honest work. The station was in a small 2-story building off Reading Road, not far from the zoo. I had my own booth. Half the lights didn't work, and the roof leaked when it rained, but it was mine. I guess the irony isn't lost on me that when the world started falling apart, I was sitting behind a microphone, talking to people who thought I was just entertainment. The thing is, I didn't stop broadcasting when everything went to hell. Not at first. It started slow. Listeners began calling in saying strange things. One guy from Florence, Kentucky, swore the hospital near him was being shut down. Said they weren't letting anyone out, not even the staff. A nurse from Norwood left a voicemail saying she saw patients seizing and biting people before the feed cut. I played the voicemail live, thinking it was fake. A hoax. That was March 14th. On March 15th, the National Guard closed I-75 just south of Dayton. They said it was for a chemical spill. They always say that. And that same night, something happened at the Cincinnati Zoo. I could see the glow from the station rooftop. There were sirens, lots of them, and gunfire. I watched blacked out Humvees pull into the area. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, we lost 3 of our 6 on-air hosts. 2 didn't show up. 1 left a message saying, "Don't go into the city." Then the phone stopped ringing. At the point I should have left, should have grabbed my go bag, driven north to Columbus, maybe tried to get to my brother's place in Marysville. But I didn't. I stayed. I told myself someone had to keep the station running, keep the information flowing. So I kept broadcasting. On March 17th, the emergency alert system kicked in, but there was no message. Just the signal tones, then dead air. No voice, no text crawl, just silence. That night, I switched the show format. No music, no poetry, just updates, rumors, anything I could gather from the police scanner, Reddit, shortwave, hell, even ham radio frequencies. I was piecing together the puzzle in real time. There were unconfirmed reports of aggression clusters in Dayton, Lexington, and northern Kentucky. Listeners said they saw people running naked down I-471 near Newport, covered in blood. Someone emailed me a grainy cell phone video from Price Hill. Looked like a mob tearing through a Dollar General. But it wasn't looting. They weren't taking anything. They were attacking. On March 19th, power became unreliable. I ran the station off the backup diesel generator. Thankfully, the tank had just been filled a week prior. Gave me about 72 hours of continuous power if I was careful. By March 20th, downtown Cincinnati was blacked out. The Great American Tower at Queen City Square, dark. That night, from the rooftop, I watched fires spreading near Findlay Market and over the Rhine. You could hear distant yelling carried by the wind, and gunshots. Always the gunshots. I went live that night and said, "If you can hear this, you're not alone." On March 21st, everything changed. A guy named Rick called into the station. Said he was an engineer stuck inside the Cincinnati subway tunnels. Yes, the old abandoned ones they never finished. He'd gone down with a crew to investigate some structural collapse under the old Race Street station. Claimed there were people down there. People who shouldn't be alive. "They don't talk," he said, voice trembling. "They move like animals, fast. Their eyes are white, and they crawl on the walls. I tried to calm him down, told him maybe it was a gas leak, hallucinations, but Rick just kept repeating, "They aren't human. They were people once, but they aren't anymore." That was the last I heard from him. I clipped that call and rebroadcast it every 20 minutes for the next 24 hours. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped someone else had seen the same thing. Maybe I just didn't want to be alone in knowing it. March 22nd was the first time I saw them in person. I'd gone outside just before dawn to siphon fuel from an abandoned Ford F-150 parked down the road. I was careful, quiet. I wore my station jacket with the reflective stripes and kept a fire axe slung over my shoulder. Something you learn quick. When the world collapses, don't rely on firearms. They're loud, draw attention. A good axe does the job just fine. As I finished topping off the generator tank, I heard movement near the alley behind the station. I crouched, ducked behind a dumpster, and waited. It was a woman, or it used to be. She was barefoot, wearing what looked like a blood-soaked hospital gown. Her arms hung limp, head tilted to one side like her neck was broken, and her mouth opened and closed in short, twitching jerks, like she was tasting the air. She moved with stuttering, almost spasmodic steps, not the slow shuffle from movies. No, this was more unnerving, broken, and then she screamed. A high, sharp, inhuman sound that echoed off the buildings like a siren. I bolted, back inside, locked the reinforced doors, killed the lights. That scream, I still hear it when I sleep. She didn't try to break in, just stood outside for nearly an hour, waiting, watching. March 24th, 2:35 a.m. That's when I got the call from Lena. She was a former EMT from Mount Healthy, holed up inside the Hamilton County Emergency Management Office with a handful of survivors. Said they had power, a working ham relay, and a secure perimeter with chain link and razor wire. She begged me to come. By 3 a.m, I was ready to leave the station. I kept my pack light, 3 MREs, 1 water filter, 2 full canteens, a spare shirt, gloves, and my SIG-P 226. I left behind most of my personal stuff. Photos, records, old tapes from the show. All of that felt like artifacts from a world that didn't exist anymore. I paused once at the studio door, hand on the knob, taking a last look at the room where I'd spent hundreds of nights surrounded by static coffee cups and glowing meters. Then I shut it behind me and descended the stairwell into the cold darkness of Reading Road. The street was quiet. Not empty, quiet. There's a difference. The air had that strange post-rain humidity you get in early spring, where the ground still holds winter, but the wind smells like thawing earth. I moved fast but careful, sticking close to alleys and abandoned storefronts. Glass crunched under my boots as I passed the shattered windows of a dry cleaner's. A burned-out police cruiser was upended halfway into a pharmacy wall across the street, its lights long dead, but the faint scent of burned fuel still lingering. Lena had given me coordinates over the phone. The emergency office was located near Coleraine Avenue, on the northwest edge of the city. That meant crossing through parts of the West End and Camp Washington, both areas dense with industrial buildings, overpasses, and long stretches with little cover. I knew the roads by heart, but I couldn't risk walking them in the open. I cut through side streets and rail corridors instead. Around 4:10 a.m, I reached the edge of I-75, near the Hopple Street overpass. The bridge had partially collapsed on the northern end. A city bus was hanging nose first off the edge, still somehow suspended by its back axle. Something about that image, so precarious, so absurd, made me stop. I stared at it for almost a minute. You don't realize how fragile infrastructure really is until the people maintaining it disappear. It wasn't long before I found my first real obstacle. Just past the intersection with Coleraine Avenue, I spotted a group of infected, 5 of them, clustered around a partially open loading dock behind a brewery. Their heads jerked in erratic, twitchy movements, and they moved with that same shattered rhythm I'd seen before, like something broken trying to mimic walking. I crouched behind a row of steel dumpsters and watched through the cracked lens of a pair of binoculars I'd taken from the station's emergency kit. One of them, a male, shirtless, with what looked like a paramedic's ID tag still hanging from his neck, snapped his head suddenly to the left, then bolted forward at a dead sprint. No warning, no noise, just a blur of motion. The others followed immediately. That's when I realized they caught the scent of something. Not me, something else. A second later, I heard the scream. Not one of theirs, a human scream. A woman's, short, sharp, then cut off. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. Then I moved. I didn't go to help. I couldn't. That's something you learn very fast. Heroism gets people killed now. You hear a scream, and your first instinct has to be to freeze, listen, and vanish. If you're lucky, it was just someone else making the mistake for you. The sun was coming up by the time I reached the emergency office. The building was a low-profile 2-story structure tucked behind a community college parking lot, with its windows boarded and front entrance fortified with pallets, fencing, and what looked like pieces of a wrecked SUV. Razor wire crowned the top of the outer barricade, and floodlights, now powered down, were mounted at all 4 corners. I approached slowly, keeping my hands visible. A camera mounted near the gate turned toward me. A moment later, a voice crackled from a mounted speaker. "Identify." "Tyler Grant," I said, raising my hands. "WLXP." Lena invited me. There was a pause, then the click of a magnetic lock. The gate groaned open. 2 people met me inside, both armed. The first was a man, maybe late 30s, with a shaved head and a tactical vest over a Cincinnati Fire Department uniform. He introduced himself as Harris. The second was Lena. She looked older than I expected, mid-40s maybe, but the lines around her eyes were sharp. She wore a grey hoodie with a worn EMT patch on one sleeve and a pistol holstered on her hip. She hugged me, quick and firm, then pulled me inside the building. "We're low on food. Water's good for now. Power's from a diesel generator, but we're rationing. Most of the area is dark. We've got 8 people total, including you. 9 if you count the kid upstairs." That's how I met Jordan. 17 years old, wiry, quick. He'd been a student at Hughes STEM High School, stuck in the building during the initial outbreak. His teacher never made it. He walked from Clifton to the shelter with nothing but a baseball bat and a backpack full of canned chili. Smart kid. Scared, but smart. The others were mostly ex-military, EMTs or city workers. One had been a dispatcher for the Cincinnati Police Department. Another was a mechanical engineer from Duke Energy who'd been maintaining the backup power systems for the city's hospitals before everything fell apart. They had a ham radio room set up in the back, a small space with foam soundproofing on the walls, and a half-dozen transceivers wired into the grid. Lena showed me the logs. Over the past 3 days, they'd made contact with groups in Louisville, Indianapolis, even as far as Charleston, West Virginia. All were in some stage of collapse. No centralized response, no FEMA, no evacuation. Just scattered pockets of survivors. One transmission stood out. It was from someone identifying as Control Delta, broadcasting from somewhere near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The signal was weak, distorted, but the message repeated every 15 minutes. "This is Control Delta. Containment failure confirmed. Initiate fallback to Zone Echo. High-value assets secured. Do not attempt re-entry. Repeat, do not attempt re-entry. Zone Echo." No one at the shelter knew what it meant, but the message had been repeating for 4 days without change. Whatever Control Delta was, they were organized, possibly military, and definitely not operating under standard protocol. I spent the next few days helping reinforce the shelter and keeping the ham relay operational. I also took over what they called Air Watch, monitoring open radio channels for distress calls, emergency transmissions, or movement reports. Most of it was noise, static, broken signals, sometimes what sounded like automated alerts looping endlessly. An eerie mechanical voice would cut in every so often. usually repeating the same vague directive. Shelter in place, await further instruction. But those instructions never came. The government voice was just a ghost now, an artifact of a system that had collapsed, but hadn't quite admitted it yet. I kept a handwritten log of every transmission that sounded remotely human. The longer I listened, the more I realized something no one wanted to admit out loud. The airwaves were getting quieter. Whatever groups were still out there, they were either going dark or getting overrun. Two separate voices I'd heard earlier in the week. One calling itself Station Kilo, somewhere outside of Columbus, and another that came from a rooftop relay in Florence. Both vanished. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't scream. They just faded out, like dying embers in the wind. We tried not to talk about what that meant. In the evenings, we distracted ourselves with whatever we could find. Jordan taught me how to open canned food with a pocket knife without slicing my palm open. Lena read through old emergency medical textbooks just to keep her hands busy. We kept the lights dim and the generator on strict cycles. 6 hours active, 6 hours rest, stretching the diesel out as long as we could. But none of us forgot what was outside the barricade, especially at night. That's when we heard them the most. Sometimes it was just the shuffle of feet scraping asphalt. Other times it was wet breathing or the high, reedy whimpering that echoed through the alleys like someone lost and crying. But you knew better than to believe it. They never moaned like in the movies. They made a sound more like teeth grinding together and lungs pulling too much air, like something trying to remember how to breathe but doing it wrong. The worst was when they stood still, just outside the light watching, not moving, not attacking, just waiting, like they knew we had to come out eventually. We had a few close calls during the week. Once, a power fluctuation cut the electric fence around the rear lot and let two of them get within 20 feet of the back door before Harris spotted them on the cameras. We learned the hard way that chain link alone wasn't enough. After that, we reinforced every side entrance with truck hoods and iron poles, welding together a patchwork of barriers that looked more like scrap art than defense. But it held. The WXRD signal didn't return for 2 days. We assumed it was another ghost broadcast, just a stuck loop from an abandoned control room, the last echoes of someone long gone. But on the third day, I caught a burst of live chatter between midnight and 1 a.m. It was scratchy, like the transmitter was failing, but clear enough to make out a voice. Male, older, probably 50s. He was reading what sounded like medical supply inventories and coordinates for some kind of airdrop site, though I doubted any drops had happened in weeks. Then, just before the signal died, he said something that made me sit bolt upright in the chair. Whatever's happening in the containment zones, it's mutating. We saw one climb. No use hiding on rooftops anymore. He didn't elaborate. The line went dead again, and that night, for the first time, I heard movement on the roof. We left the next morning before sunrise. Lena didn't like it, but she gave us her blessing. The shelter couldn't spare more than 2 people without risking security, so Harris and I packed what we could: a Mossberg 590 shotgun, my SIG, 3 road flares, an emergency ham set on a strapped-down Pelican case, 2 spare fuel canisters, and a laminated Cincinnati street map we'd marked with danger zones and reported sightings. Lena had underlined the words, "No go past Newport," and "High activity near I-471. We took a beat-up Ford Explorer one of the engineers had hot-wired. It was missing a rear window, the hood was held shut with a ratchet strap, and the right side mirror had been replaced with duct tape and a piece of scrap plastic. But the engine ran, and the tyres held pressure. That was all that mattered. Driving through the city was a surreal experience. The streets were frozen in the exact moment of collapse. Traffic jams had become monuments to panic. People abandoning cars mid-turn, doors open, belongings scattered in the gutters. It was worse near hospitals. At the corner of Clifton and MLK, we passed a city ambulance that had been turned on its side and burned out from the inside. A half-melted oxygen tank had exploded the back doors clean off, and there were footprints, bloody, smeared, too many to count, leading away into the adjacent parking garage. We crossed into Kentucky via the Clay Wade Bailey Bridge. A fog coming off the Ohio River was thick and cold, and for a long moment we drove in near total silence, except for the rumble of tires on concrete. Harris kept scanning the sidewalks with a small set of binoculars, while I tried to boost the ham receiver's signal, hoping to re-establish contact with WXRD before we arrived. Nothing came through but static. We reached Highland Heights around 8 a.m. The community radio tower was just off University Drive, perched on a small concrete pad, surrounded by what used to be a student parking lot. The station building itself was small, maybe 3 rooms total, and partially boarded up. The call sign on the side, once painted in bright red block letters, had been scratched out and replaced with "Keep Out" in thick black spray paint. We parked 2 blocks away, hidden behind an overturned delivery truck, and approached on foot. The air smelled like mold and scorched metal. Flies buzzed in lazy spirals around an open trash barrel that had been used as a burn pit. There were signs of recent activity: fresh footprints in dried mud, scuffed concrete, even a crushed cigarette still warm. Someone was still here. We circled to the rear entrance, where a sheet of plywood had been nailed over a shattered doorframe. Harris tapped 3 times, slow, then quick, then slow again. A code Lena had said to use. For a long moment, there was no response. Then came a rusted creak of hinges. A narrow slit opened in the door, and 2 eyes stared out at us. "Who sent you?" The voice rasped. It was the same voice I'd heard over the air. "We heard your signal," I said. "WLXP, we've got survivors, a shelter in Hamilton County. We thought you were gone." The door opened slowly. The man standing behind it was thin, pale, with deep creases around his mouth and eyes like he hadn't slept in days. His name tag, still barely legible under layers of grime, read Fred. He led us inside without another word. The studio was a mess of old gear, wires, food wrappers, and handwritten notes taped to every available surface. 2 others were with him. An older woman named Margie, who had once worked as a communications technician at the airport, and a young man named Lucas, who said he'd been a journalism student before the outbreak. Their generator had run dry 2 days earlier, and they were rationing power using a set of 6 car batteries chained together with a solar array pulled from a hardware store roof. We stayed with them the rest of the day, exchanging information, sharing what supplies we could. Fred had notebooks full of broadcasts and signals he'd picked up over the past month, including some that seemed to originate from underground relays or encrypted military bands. One kept repeating the phrase "biohazard protocol breach," followed by a list of numbered sectors, none of which matched any known public emergency maps. But what caught my attention most was a map pinned to the wall, marked with heavy red circles around 3 specific areas: the National Guard Armory near Fort Thomas, a sealed medical research lab outside Lexington, and a cluster of tunnels beneath downtown Cincinnati labeled simply Origin. When I asked Fred about it, he just looked away and said, "We thought it started in Atlanta, maybe even overseas. But whatever this is, it's local. Something happened here first." I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because of possibility. If we could get to that lab, if there were records, equipment, maybe even researchers still alive, there was a chance we could understand what this infection really was. A virus, a parasite, something else. Understanding was the only path to fighting it, and we were running out of time. The next morning, Fred agreed to come with us. Margie and Lucas stayed behind to keep the signal going. It was still dark when we rolled out of Highland Heights in the same battered Explorer, now heavier with an extra passenger and a reinforced steel mesh screen welded over the windshield. Fred had packed a small duffel, 3 notebooks, a shortwave radio scanner, and a revolver with only 4 rounds left. Said he didn't plan to use it unless things went truly south. I didn't ask what he meant by that. We drove west on I-275 until we reached I-75 again, looping south toward Lexington. Most of the highway was choked with wrecked cars, scorched civilian vehicles, and the occasional military Humvee, stripped clean of anything useful. The exits leading to Georgetown and Frankfurt were barricaded with heavy concrete blocks and improvised checkpoints, long since abandoned. We saw no patrols, no aircraft, and no other vehicles in motion. Kentucky had gone dark. The sky hung low with heavy clouds, casting everything in a grey, muted light that made every distant figure feel like it might suddenly sprint in your direction. Fred told us more about the facility as we travelled. Sector 12, as he called it, was once a federally funded research compound operating under the Department of Health and Human Services. Officially, it had been tasked with vaccine development for emergent viruses in conjunction with the University of Kentucky's medical research program. In reality, he said, it had been repurposed in the last 5 years as a high-containment virology lab, Biosafety Level 4. The kind of place where you don't just walk around in scrubs, you work in a positive pressure suit, inside sealed chambers, with redundant airlocks and internal sterilization cycles. The kind of place built to keep things in. He claimed the last messages they'd received from the facility, about 2 weeks before he stopped hearing anything at all, suggested something had been discovered in Appalachian cave soil samples. Not a virus in the traditional sense. Something ancient, something dormant until disturbed. The term they used was cross-kingdom pathogenicity, meaning it didn't behave like any known pathogen. It affected cells, but also behavior, cognition, even perception. This wasn't some lab mistake, Fred said flatly, staring out the window. They were testing it, on prisoners, maybe even volunteers. They wanted to see what it could do. Then it got out. By mid-afternoon, we reached the rural outskirts of Fayette County. Every town we passed had been ransacked or burned. Traffic lights hung sideways from snapped cables. Power lines draped across roads like vines. We stopped briefly in a collapsed gas station off KY 922 to refuel from a rusting work truck and scavenge what little food we could from the snack aisles. Jordan's baseball bat had been mounted with nails and rewrapped in grip tape. Harris carried the Mossberg over his shoulder like a lifeline. No one spoke unless absolutely necessary. There was an unspoken understanding between all of us now that we were heading towards something we might not walk away from. Sector 12 was located inside a heavily wooded area off Ironworks Pike, just north of the Kentucky Horse Park. From the road, you wouldn't know anything was there. The entrance was marked only by a rusted metal gate and a USGS survey station sign that had been shot full of holes. We left the Explorer on the road and approached on foot through a thicket of oak and ash trees, moving slow and low through the underbrush. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, just the wind and the occasional creak of old trees. The outer perimeter was surrounded by a rusted barbed wire fence. Beyond it stood a series of squat, concrete buildings, half sunk into the earth like bunkers. The main structure had no windows and only one visible entrance, a sealed blast door embedded into the hillside, flanked by 2 decomposed security cameras dangling by frayed wires. The air reeked of mold, iron, and something else, like damp earth rotting from the inside. We forced the gate open with a crowbar and advanced cautiously. Fred moved with purpose, navigating the outer yard like he'd memorized the layout. He'd never been here in person, but said he'd seen blueprints and aerial shots. The door required a keycard and passcode, both long dead, but Harris managed to pop the control panel with a flathead and hotwire the locking mechanism after 10 minutes of sweating under pressure. The blast door shuddered open a few inches, and we squeezed inside. The interior was pitch black, save for the dull green glow of emergency lights that still flickered deep down the main corridor. A battery backup system, Fred guessed. The hallway was narrow, lined with white tile walls smeared with dried handprints and long rust-coloured drag marks. Someone had tried to barricade the inner doors with metal carts and file cabinets, but they'd been shoved aside, violently. We descended in silence, stepping over collapsed gurneys, broken monitors, and the occasional half-buried lab coat still soaked in something that hadn't dried right. Fred guided us toward the central lab chamber, sub-level 3. The elevator was dead, so we took the emergency stairs, each floor dimmer and more claustrophobic than the last. By the time we reached the final level, the air was thick and wet, like being underground during a flood. We passed rooms labelled specimen holding, cryogenic storage, and biohazard containment. Most were empty, a few weren't. One chamber still had power to its observation window. Inside was a sealed medical exam room with a heavy ventilation system and bolted floor restraints. Something had been chained there once. The restraints were torn open. The reinforced glass bore hairline fractures in a spiral pattern, like something had screamed at it again and again until it cracked. But there was no body, no bones, only claw marks and a scorched smear that had turned black and crusted over like tar. We finally reached the archive server room. Rows of steel racks still hummed with residual energy from an auxiliary power unit. Fred plugged in a portable drive and began copying what data remained. Logs, camera footage, internal messages. Most files were corrupted, a few weren't. Harris and I took turns guarding the door, though nothing moved in the hallway. Not yet. The final document Fred found was a video file, dated February 26th. The timestamp placed it about 3 weeks before the first public outbreaks. It showed a man strapped to a gurney, shaking violently. 3 scientists stood behind glass, one reading vitals off a clipboard while the others monitored neurological scans. The subject's eyes were open, pupils blown wide, and his teeth had cracked from constant gnashing. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't alive either. Something in him twitched with a rhythm that didn't match human anatomy. When he finally screamed, the audio overloaded and the lights in the room behind him flickered. Then the screen went black. Fred ejected the drive without a word. We didn't stay any longer than we had to. We emerged from the facility just as the sun dipped below the hills. The forest bathed in red-orange light, but something had changed. The quiet was gone. The air carried a vibration, a kind of pressure. Harris froze halfway through the fence and slowly raised his hand. In the distance, something moved between the trees. Not walking, climbing. They were in the branches. 3 of them at first, then 6. Gaunt figures, eyes pale, mouths trembling like they were trying to remember speech. They didn't rush us, not yet. They watched, studied, like they knew we'd found something. We ran, back to the Explorer, back to the road, and for 30 miles we didn't look back, didn't speak, didn't stop until the sound of our own breath became louder than the tires. That night, back at the shelter, we uploaded the files to a hardline connection we'd reactivated 2 days prior. There was no internet anymore, but there were other ways. Radio towers, frequency relays, the kind the military used to keep hidden messages alive long after the wars ended. We used every watt of power we had to broadcast the truth. Fred read from the recovered logs. Lena confirmed the locations. I reactivated the WLXP feed, rerouted through the ham gear, and said the words I never thought I'd say again. This is Tyler Grant, WLXP 90.7. If you can hear this, the outbreak began in Kentucky, Sector 12. It wasn't natural, it wasn't random. They were testing something ancient, and they lost control. We've seen what's coming next. They're changing, climbing, learning, get above ground, get high, get out of the valleys. Repeat, do not stay in the lowlands. Do not go silent. Keep talking, keep broadcasting. This frequency is still alive, and we left it running because we weren't going to be the last voices, not if we could help it. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.